On Tuesday or Wednesday, 2 weeks ago, I was in the Hampton Hotel in town. And I was delivering on behalf of the organisation that I work for what I thought was a very incisive, intuitive, informative talk and seminar workshop on the vagrancies of being an employer and the responsibilities of being an employer, and to such heady issues as the psychosocial hazard within the working environment of the employment. And I thought I did particularly well. And it came to the end of it, and I was approached by the CEO of Rathdown, and I thought, oh, this is brilliant. I must have done well. And he said, Tony, how are you? That went very well. I said, thank you. And he said, we're having a function. I thought, this is it. We're having a function, he said, and he told me where it was on and everything else. He said, you know, we were going to get a comedian, but we thought we'd get you instead. So I thought, you know, is that a compliment or a backhanded compliment? He's asked me to speak to you tonight, I suppose, about the area of communication, how we communicate with one another. And I'm very much aware that we've had the golf, we're retired. I'm very much aware that we've had the half a ton of spuds and the backpacks a lot of lamb. So we're very tired, and we've all had our prizes, and there's about to be the raffle, which is probably the real reason you're only still sitting here. It's not listening to me. But I do want to go through a few things with you. Communications originally comes from our mother. You'll all agree with that. We all remember the communications that Mammy teaches us. It's very good. I always remember some of the things that she taught me, and that kind of confused me a little as I was growing up. The first thing was, shut up and eat your dinner. Close your mouth and eat your dinner. That was a beauty. But there was a story, I mean, forgive me for telling you, but dads also do it first. And I heard a very good communication story about a dad who said to his son, I need to have a talk with you. You're now 10 years of age. He said, yes, Dad. He said, I want to talk to you about something that's very serious and it'll stand for you the rest of your life. You need to know this. And he said, oh no, Dad, no, please. He said, no, I'm going to have to tell you this. He said, it's very, very important. He said, your mum can't tell you this. This is dad and son. He said, Dad, I don't want to know. He said, why don't you want to know? He said, well, in the past 3.5 to 4 years, you've told me that there was no tooth fairy. Then you told me there was no Easter bunny. Then you told me there was no Santa Claus. If you're going to sit here now and tell me when I get to 18 that I can't have sex, I will be absolutely devastated. We'd sometimes get the communication a little wrong. I suppose we all have communicators and people that teach us. One of the people who taught me communications many, many years ago, and a giant of Irish sort of history, I suppose, it would have been a man called Dermot Earley. And he tells a great story about health and safety and golf, which I'm going to tell you at the back end of my chat with you this evening. But there are a few other areas in terms of communication that I want to talk to you about. First of all is the thing of the intonation. You know, you've heard this before. It's not what you said, it was how you said it. You know how that kind of trips us up every now and again? Let me give you a phrase, and then we'll just examine it very, very briefly. Why don't I take you for dinner tonight? Totally innocuous. Could be said by any time, and it sounds good. But the intonation sometimes will land us in trouble with the ladies if we get it wrong. Why don't I take you for dinner tonight? And what does the lady think? Who else did you think you were bringing? What was your plan that fell apart that now you're going to start bringing me? Let's take the same phrase again and switch it again. Why don't I take you for dinner tonight? Why? Is there Champions League football on tomorrow night? You didn't want to take me out? Am I not good enough for you to take me out in the Champions League football on? It does happen, doesn't it? Why don't I take you for dinner tonight? Why? Is that because I burned supper last night? We just got to be careful about the intonation. And of course, in business, it's very, very important. If we're making the introduction to somebody, you know, there are various ways of doing it. And I could have stood here earlier on for the formal introduction, said, good evening everybody, my name is Tony Kerins. I work for Peninsula Business Services, and you would have gone back to eating your tea. If we are introducing ourselves to somebody, they say, the gurus tell us, and one of the best things we can do is say to somebody, I think we know somebody in common. I call that the LinkedIn approach. So if you're meeting somebody in a business environment, or you're meeting somebody in a networking environment, and the chamber is very much involved in all of this and building, so I think we know somebody in common. My little tip to you is make sure you do know somebody in common, so check LinkedIn beforehand if you're going to do that. But one of the most effective methods of getting people to listen to you when you want to communicate with them, can anybody hazard a guess as to what it might be? It goes back to our very base nature of who we are as humans.
Look in their eyes.
Sorry?
Look in
That's the first thing. That's the, oh, you touched on something completely different again. That's the non-verbal communication, which is absolutely brilliant. The very baseline is, once upon a time. Things go quiet. Because even as children, we learn to stop and listen to that, didn't we? Or the alternative to that is, I want to tell you a story. And people listen. That catches their attention. So in business, remember to do that. Because it's important to get communication across in business. And I think it's very important for a company to get across its values in business. And to tell people what their communicative value is. For to state your presence, your values, your commitments, etc., etc. And if that's got to do with something like selling even. I heard a great story about selling. And that has nothing, absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with selling. And it goes back to about 1943. And it was the biography of Winston Churchill. And Churchill had taken a black taxi from the Houses of Parliament to the BBC where he was about to deliver a very important speech. And this goes to show you the value of commitment of service to the customer. On the way, he said to the taximan, and he realised the taximan didn't recognise him. Back then, it wouldn't have been beyond reason to understand that. He said to the taximan, if you wait outside of the BBC, he said, I'd like to use you to get back to where you've just taken me from. And the taximan said, I can't. He probably said, I can't go, and I'm not going to do an English accent because I wouldn't be very good at it. He said, I can't. I have to get home and listen to the radio to somebody called Churchill. He's going to give us a speech about the war, and it's very important. I heard it's very good. And Churchill was a little chuffed at that. He thought, that's brilliant. So when they got to the BBC, he said to the guy, he tipped him a £5, which was about a month's wages back then. He tipped him a £5 and said, thank you very much. And the guy said, you know what, Gove? He said, to hell with Churchill. I heard he's a bit of a plonker anyway. I'll stay here and wait for you. Customer service, everybody. Get that across to your people. Communicate your customer service and the customer coming first. In terms of what we spoke about on the day that I met Peter, we had spoken about issues of health and safety, and we'd spoken about issues of employment law. And you know, we could go in and talk about health and safety statements, and we could talk about risk assessments, and we could talk about, actually I will talk about risk assessment for 1 second. I'm not going to bore you. How many people here have ever done a risk assessment? 1, 2, 3, 4. It's great, okay. They're boring, you would think. They have to be done, we know that. I did one recently in my house. I came downstairs and went into the kitchen at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was waiting to get ready for work, and I heard the kids coming downstairs behind me, and I noticed an iron and an ironing board in the middle of the floor, and the iron was plugged in. And the kids were coming tearing through, and I knew the dog was with them, so I panicked. I put away the iron, I put away the ironing board, and I turned around and said to the kids, you two slow down. Put that dog out. Now, was that a health and safety risk assessment? He said, yes, please. I thought it was very good. Brilliant. Thank you. Who said brilliant? Thank you very much. But actually, if I was an employer, it was very bad, because I would have had to go through the system, and this is how we communicated. Because I could never understand health and safety risk assessment. As an employer, I should have, in reality, written down that I put away the iron on the iron board, turned to the two kids, initially with disciplinaries for running, dismissed the dog, and then had my wife in on the disciplinary for leaving out the iron on the ironing board, but I wouldn't have done that because I would have ended up wearing it. So we need to communicate those values to our people as well as to how we do something and why we do something. So we've looked at the area of communications for sales, we've looked at the area of communications for health and safety. Then there are the areas of dealing with problems that happen internally within our organisations. And we can look at the areas of discrimination and bullying. Again, we've got to communicate across our values to people, because people don't know if they're discriminating and they don't know if they're bullying. I'll tell you a story about bullying. I went to a pre-Debs party in Walkinstown about 2 years ago, and I met with a very nice young fellow that I trained football for years beforehand, and I shook hands and we looked well in the tux, and I said to him, you know, Dave, you look really, really well there, it's great to see you. But I did notice that he was wearing these bands on his arms, and I said to him, the bands, what are they for? He said, well, this one is Amnesty International, this one is anti-bullying, and he had quite a few. I thought, you know what, you turned into a really rounded young man, well done. I said, where do you get those and how much do they cost? He said, I don't know, Tony, we beat up the first years and robbed them off them before we leave the school. He didn't realise he was a bully. Nobody had communicated the bullying instances to him. So it's about communicating in business as well. We will have several other areas that we could talk about in the areas of even in tribunals and how stuff can be communicated across the tribunals. There's a very good friend of mine who's a barrister who told me that it's amazing the way a story can come across in communication and reality can be something completely different. He told me a story about he'd been called in to look at an issue of where a lady had said that during a pay negotiation, the owner of the organisation had had a dog snarling chained to the table. So we all had visions of lock, stock and four smoking barrels. To counter it, they had to show the reality of the communication and put in front of them what actually happened. So they had to send out for the owner and send out for the dog. The owner arrived in at 85 on a walking stick with a picture of the dog because the dog had died, and it was a 17-year-old Westie. So the communication of the picture that had arrived into the room was not the communication of the reality that was outside. Again, in business, we need to be able to value and look at that whole area of communication. And the whole area of listening as well. And again, not to keep you for too long, I'll get to the very last story of my little sojourn with you this evening, and it goes back to the story of one of my mentors, Dermot Early, who tells a golf story, and a health and safety story, I suppose, combined. Two ladies were sitting having tea and coffee and biscuits, having already finished a round of golf, and they were watching the 18th hole coming down. Four gentlemen were playing 4-ball scramble coming in. And as they were about to hit the ball, mid-fairway, to the end, they were watching it, and one of the guys hit the ball, it didn't go right, went straight to the right-hand side, and they saw a poor gentleman double over in pain and down rolling on the ground. So they immediately jumped out and ran to the spot because their background was medical. The first lady came up and she said, "Stand back please, I'm a doctor, I can deal with this." So they duly stood back. So she started to work on the area that she considered was probably very, very painful. The young man was rolling around the ground screaming, and she started to work with it. After about 5 minutes, he calmed down, stood up, and she said to him, "Do you feel a lot better?" He said, "Thank you very much, I feel much better." He said, "Are you really a doctor?" And she said, "I am." He said, "You couldn't look at my thumb, I think it's broken where the ball hit it." It takes a while for it to sink in. I would like to thank Peter for asking me to come along here this evening to speak to you very briefly on the areas of communications and how we communicate ideas across. I would like to mention to you that Peter and myself will probably into the future organise events where business owners and people who are interested in that whole area of communication and dealing with business and dealing with sales. And can I tell you what, actually, credit control is one other area. I'll tell you something before we finish up in the area of credit control. And I don't believe this is a true story, but I think it's a very funny story. I was told that the gentleman in the picture that you all remember from the Irish press, when the Troika were heading into government buildings to renegotiate what it was we were going to do for a bailout. You all remember the iconic picture of the gentleman sitting outside begging as they were heading in. Do you remember that from I think it was the Independent. I was told that as he was on his way in, he asked the head of the IMF for some money. And the head of the IMF stopped and said, "I'm very, very sorry, I do not carry cash, you have to understand that. But I'm going in here to the hotel, there's an ATM, and I will get some cash and bring it to you on the way out." And the guy said, "Oh, I don't know about that." He said, "I hate giving credit." I just wanted to mention that to you. So as I said to you, on the day into the future, contact Peter. I'd like to thank Peter for inviting me along. Enjoy the rest of your raffle, enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you once again. I'll speak to you soon.